I don't like this up here. Down here. There we go. All right. So, ow. That's for me. You will eventually get it back, but it's for me first. Okay. Just broke a nail. All right, y'all. So we are, Rosalind, you need to be in a desk, please. All right, we are going to be talking about, like I said, our golden boy, Mr. Herbert Hoover, Iowa's greatest treasure other than Ashton Kutcher. And maybe corn, I don't know. So, like I said, we're going to be talking about basically, we're going to be answering the question or trying to answer the question, was Herbert Hoover actually a bad president, or was he just put in a bad situation, okay? Because obviously, you know, Herbert Hoover kind of takes office, and very early in his term, the Great Depression happens, the stock market crashes, and things start to fall apart. So we're going to explore kind of the 4 years of his presidency and try and answer that question. Was Herbert Hoover actually a bad president, or is he just given a bad situation? Okay, which we can do that conversation with a bunch of different presidents throughout history. We kind of had that conversation with Andrew Johnson way back at the beginning of U.S. History A. Okay, but now we're going to do it with Herbert Hoover. So let's start talking about his presidency a little bit with his campaign. Can't start talking about a presidency if we don't talk about what got you there. Campaign, election campaign. Can't deal with it anymore. Okay, so Hoover's election campaign was very, very strong for a variety of different reasons. Hoover was basically the third Republican voted in this decade. And we already talked about the fact that having 3 presidents in a decade is pretty rare on its own, especially 3 of the same, you know, political standing or the same political party. So with that being said, Hoover kind of came at it strong with saying, you know, the 20s have already been prosperous because of strong Republican leadership, and he promised to continue that prosperity through, you know, through the rest of the 1920s into the 1930s, you know, and beyond. So typical politicians speak, right? That things have been awesome so far, and that things are going to continue to thrive and prosper underneath him because, you know, he's Herbert Hoover. Look at all the awesome things that he's done so far. He's going to continue doing those things as we go forward, okay? One of the big portions of his campaign, or one of the big, like, propaganda pieces of his campaign was this thing called a chicken for every pot, okay? It was a large piece of his campaign that he put out to the American people, especially to kind of like the rural Midwesterners, like where he came from, that basically said, hey, you know, throughout my presidency, I am going to make sure that every single family every day for dinner has a chicken in every pot, basically saying that the United States is going to prosper so well that nobody will have to worry about, you know, going hungry. Everyone will have the necessities that they need to continue thriving, okay? And it was a really good thing that he reached out to like the rural population, the Midwestern population, because if you guys remember, the farming crisis was ongoing throughout the 1920s, and some of those farmers were feeling those effects way before the rest of the country did. So Hoover saying, I'm going to make sure that you have, you know, your family is fed and that we are prosperous and that we are thriving, felt good, right? Another reason that Hoover really succeeded in his election campaign is because the president before him, Calvin Coolidge, as we all know as Silent Cal, was not too much to look at, basically. He didn't do a whole lot. He stuck to his guns. He did what he was supposed to do as president, but didn't rock the boat that much. Yeah.
Not much to listen to.
Yes. Yeah. Not much to listen to. I mean, not really much to look at either, but not much to listen to, not much to do, basically. He did his job. He silently basically said, you know, all right, I'm done. That was enough for me. Presidency's not for me. So having somebody with a lot of enthusiasm and having somebody with a lot of opinions was honestly refreshing for the United States, because they just wanted somebody to like care, or at least look like they cared, okay? So Hoover has got a lot on his back, or at least a lot on his shoulders, carrying on his shoulders going into his presidency, because his election campaign was so prosperous and so good. I've got a video to start us off really quick, just a quick rundown of the election of 1928, should be 28 because he took office in 29. Kind of reviewing all of the cool things that Hoover did during his election campaign and how his opponents viewed him. So just super quick.
Presidential elections in American history. The 36th presidential election in American history took place on November 6, 1928, the day I turned -53. Calvin Coolidge had a smooth second term. The economy remained strong, and the federal government even had a huge surplus. If he wanted to run for another full term, he probably would have been easily reelected. However, Coolidge had announced the previous summer that he had no intention of running by cutting out strips of paper with the statement, "I do not choose to run for president" in 1928 on them, and handing them out to reporters at the press conference. Coolidge said after the slips of paper were handed out, quote, "There will be nothing more from this office today," unquote, and he walked out. So this left the Republican nomination wide open. The leading candidates were Herbert Hoover, the Secretary of Commerce, Frank Orrin Loden, the former governor of Illinois, and Senate Majority Leader Charles Curtis, who was from my home state of Kansas. Not impressed by these choices, many Republicans tried to draft Coolidge, but Coolidge turned it down. Hoover ended up getting the nomination, with Charles Curtis as his running mate. The Democratic Party nominated Al Smith, the governor of New York, who was running for president a third time. Smith was the first Roman Catholic to be a major party's candidate for president. The Democrats nominated Joseph Taylor Robinson, a U.S. senator from Arkansas, as his running mate. Robinson and Smith seemed like the odd couple, but actually complemented each other well. No third parties really stood out during this election at all, and so we had another classic two-way battle. Hoover had the momentum due to the fact that things were going pretty darn well overall in the country. In fact, at Hoover's nomination acceptance speech, he said, quote, "We in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of this land. We shall soon, with the help of God, be in sight of the day when poverty will be banished from this land." Unquote. Little did Hoover know that soon those words would come back to bite him in the butt. However, things were looking pretty good now for him, especially since Al Smith's religion became a major issue during the campaign. Many Protestants feared that Smith would take orders from the Pope if he led the country. In addition to anti-Catholicism, Smith's opposition to prohibition and his association with the corruption of Tammany Hall likely would cost him votes. And here are the results. Herbert Hoover easily won, becoming the 31st president in American history. In the Electoral College, he dominated so much it was a bit embarrassing for the Democrats. Hoover received 444 electoral votes and even won states like North Carolina and Virginia, which hadn't voted Republican since 1872. Al Smith received just 87 electoral votes. Hoover also dominated with the popular vote, getting 58.2% to Smith's 40.8%. It was safe to say the Republicans were on a roll, as this was their third consecutive presidential landslide victory. Charles Curtis became the 31st vice president in American history. Fun fact and spoiler alert, this was the last presidential election in American history won by Republicans without either Richard Nixon or a member of the Bush family running for them. Pretty crazy, eh?
Fun stuff. I always forget about that little fun fact at the very end that Republicans go on a losing streak basically because America sees Hoover is so bad that Republicans don't get nominated for or don't, win anything for a very, very long time after this, okay? One of the things that is also interesting about Hoover's election campaign, so 444 electoral college votes is a massive amount of votes, and 58.2% is, today an unheard of margin, basically. Like all presidential elections basically since 1980 have been within like the 54% ratio. So 58% of a popular vote is massive in comparison to things that we've seen before. Okay, so Hoover wins in a landslide, and highlights a couple of the things I already said, that the Republicans were on a winning streak. Everybody saw the Republican Party and saw the Republican platform as reasons to continue this prosperity, and Hoover just had the look, basically, that people were just like, all right, cool, that's the guy, we're going with it. Okay. All right, so this is just an example of that chicken for every pot adverts that would go out. Basically, these aren't the advertisements, and these aren't the political commercials that we see today, right? Basically, this is talking about the fact that, the Republican Party has been so successful in creating this environment or creating an economy that has been prosperous for everyone, and those who are still kind of on the cutting edge or on the bottom edge will continue to thrive, or we're going to bring them up with everyone else to make sure that every family has a chicken for every pot. Basically, saying, kind of like they mentioned in the video, that the Republican Party created this prosperous environment, and we're going to continue to create it, and everything's going to continue to be great. And like Hoover mentioned, that we'll see the end of poverty, et cetera, which is the most ironic phrase ever uttered in an election campaign, probably ever. Okay, so vote for Hoover for wages, dividends, progress, and prosperity, et cetera. Okay. So Hoover obviously wins in this massive landslide. In his first year, 1929, so he takes office in early in January of 1929, and by October, the stock market crashes. We're just rehashing this information, basically, okay? So the stock market crashes in October, and President Hoover, the main thing on his mind, as with many politicians and many economic experts, the main thing on his mind was to prevent panic from spreading throughout the economy, right? When we talked about the stock market crash, we talked about the fact that that was the main concern, and that's going to be one of the main downfalls, is people started to panic like crazy. Everything was lost in the stock market. If the stock market crashes, they're going to equate that to the economy crashing. People start pulling money out of banks, et cetera, et cetera. The tumbleweed continues to roll, right? So President Hoover, when the stock market crashes, tries to lift people's spirits and tries to get people to stop panicking, basically telling people, keep your money in the banks. The economy is doing just fine. The economy is not the stock market. The stock market is its own entity. We'll make sure everything is fine. Don't panic, okay? After the stock market officially crashes, like once, Black Tuesday comes around and the stock market has to stop and they have to reevaluate things, Herbert Hoover ends up calling a conference within that week of different business leaders, and basically told them, all right, the economy is probably going to start tankering if the stock market has already started. You need to make sure to not lower wages, to keep spirits high and paychecks high, okay? His thought process is that if he could have all of these industry leaders promise to keep paychecks the same and promise to keep people's wages the same, that people would continue to, like, that income that they were still getting because they were not lowered and they were not fired, they would put it back into the economy, right? Stimulating the economy. So Hoover told all of these industry leaders, do not fire people as best as you can. Do not lower wages. Try and keep the spirits high. Give incentives for working, et cetera, to try and stop the economy from crashing wholly. So that was kind of the quick fix when it came to immediately after the stock market crash. In terms of his long-term fix, so within the months after the stock market crashed, he was pushing to Congress, and he believed in spending and construction. So in theory, this plan was, kind of genius, okay? So he really wanted to create or speed up different construction projects to create employment, okay? So if I can find things for the unemployed of the country to do, like construction projects or like beautification projects, et cetera, then they will have a job, the unemployment rate will go down, money will be flowing through people's pockets, and we'll get the economy going again, okay? So in theory, that was a good idea, to create or speed up construction projects to create employment, okay? However, where his falter came is that instead of just providing more money for these construction projects or more money to pay these people, he asked Congress for a tax cut so that he could use that to spend more on construction projects, okay? So instead of like creating new money or finding new avenues for money, he was basically just recycling old money. So nothing new was coming into the system and nothing new was coming into the economy, okay? But still, the theory or the idea was good in theory. And like I said, these were all supposed to be long-term projects, or these were supposed to be long-term ideas. The stock market crashes in October as we're looking towards the end of 1929. This is what's coming for 1930, okay? Or at least that's what he wants. So year one, obviously nobody could predict, well, theoretically, nobody could predict the stock market crashing this heavily. He's taking it in stride. He's trying to figure out things to keep the economy afloat, okay? All right. So year one didn't go as smoothly as planned, or didn't quite work out the way that we wanted it to. Let's talk about year two, 1930. So at the beginning of 1930, there is a quote that is put in a New York Times editorial, basically saying, quoting, "No one in his place could have done more, and very few of his predecessors could have done as much." Basically saying that Herbert Hoover is doing his best. Have you ever seen the thing that's like cried but did the thing anyway? That's kind of where Herbert Hoover is right now. That's the vibe check, okay? So during 1930, during his second year of his term, the government was really trying to do a lot. They were coming up with these different construction programs, including things like the Hoover Dam and other large-scale construction projects that could get people employed, okay? So the government was really trying to do a lot, but the consumers, the people, the citizens were not spending. People were so afraid from the bank failures, so afraid of basically handing out their money in any way, shape, or form, whether it's to buy something or whether it's, to give it to the bank to hold it. They were so afraid of other people having their money that they were still spending less than they needed to. They weren't stimulating like they needed to. So because they weren't spending and because they weren't buying like these consumer goods that were profiting the economy, businesses started to go under. So for example, throughout the 1920s, the fashion industry was really thriving. People were buying more and more clothes, whether on installment buying or with their actual cash, their liquid money. But once the banks started to shut down, and once we hit this point around 1930, 1929, the desire to go and buy all those things were very, very low, even when you had money, okay? So now those textile industries and those manufacturers are going to start shutting down. So in response to this, that, even though the government is doing a lot of things, but the United States is still not cooperating, basically, Herbert Hoover created something called the President's Emergency Committee for Employment, or PECE, to coordinate state and local relief programs and develop methods for increasing employment in the private sector. So basically, all right, the US government, like the federal government, is trying as best as they can to give you things to do. But the states have to put in some work as well. So private companies, private industries, private businesses are going to have to step up as well, okay? Which, again, a really good idea in theory. Like, hey, the federal government shouldn't have to do everything. The states and the private businesses should have to make an effort too. But it's really hard to motivate somebody to do something when you don't give them anyone to lead it and no money to do it, okay? If you hired me to build you a house and then said, oh, by the way, I'm not giving you any money to get any of the construction materials, and I know you have no idea how to build a house, but I'm not going to give you a project leader either. How am I supposed to build the house? Okay. So even though the president has this really good idea that private businesses and states should get involved, they don't give them any leadership to help them, and they don't give them any federal funding to give them the supplies, okay? So we just keep spending the Federal Reserve, basically. We keep spending federal money in hopes that it will continue to stimulate the economy outside of consumer goods. And we just are kind of hoping for the best by the end of 1930. Okay? Yes, Aiden.
Something that I wonder, so for people that are wealthy, how much does like the economy dropping like affect them?
So it depends on how wealthy you are, but generally, like, that's a tough question to answer. If we're looking at 1930, let's say that we're using extremely wealthy to qualify like business owners and stuff. So like, the Rockefellers of the world who own these giant industries or own these giant companies, it's going to hit them at least a little bit because their companies are going to be suffering because people aren't spending anything, right? But the theory with being extremely wealthy is that there's always some backup. There's always something there. Right? If you remember from our chart on the thing that we did yesterday about the causes of the Great Depression, that the 2% that makes like over that $10,000 mark, it's only 2%, but that 2% stays consistent for a very long time. All right, so like I said, by the end of 1930, or as we are going through 1930, the government is really trying its best to stimulate the economy, but the United States people and the state governments, private businesses have to put in some work too, and that's just not being met, okay? So if I were the president at this point, if I was putting myself in Herbert Hoover's shoes, I might start to get a little frustrated, right? I'm trying my best to do what I need to do, but it's just not working out, okay? Moving into year 3 with 1931, okay? 1931 is not a great year either. It's not the worst. It's not great though, okay? We are slowly seeing a decline in bank closures, so that's a good thing. That's good. No more bank closures, okay? Or at least very few. But in terms of the federal government and Hoover's role, Herbert Hoover kept offering programs like trying to get things started like PECE, and they kept getting shut down for the same reasons, that there was nobody to lead them, that there was no funding. People were just starting to lose hope. Okay? It was like dangling something in front of them and then keep snatching away. Okay. So like think of like your favorite thing in the whole wide world, like your favorite food, your favorite candy, or something like that. And somebody's just standing in front of you with a fishing pole, just like, you want it? What's that? I don't remember what TV show that's on. You want it? You want? And then they just keep, yeah, and then they just keep throwing it away. They just keep bringing it away, right? That's how the American people felt. That Hoover kept dangling some hope in front of them, or at least the federal government kept dangling some hope in front of them, dangling different relief programs, anything, and then it would get shut down or it would get taken away. Okay, so people were really starting to lose hope. That gets tired after a while. Okay. 1931 is when we also start to see the emergence of these ramshackle cities, basically, these ramshackle communities called Hoovervilles. Very unlovingly named after Herbert Hoover, okay? Other than just losing hope, the American people are also losing their homes, they're losing their income, they're losing their jobs. So like I said, lots of Americans by this time are losing more than just hope. Hooverville is described as a shanty town that is thrown together for people to live. So basically areas that are unoccupied or like on the outskirts of industry or industrial areas, et cetera, et cetera. If I don't have a home anymore, I'm gonna go grab my cardboard boxes or whatever I can find. Like I said, most of the time they're outside of like industrial areas, so they can use scrap metal or anything that's thrown away into the dumps to build something to put a roof over my head. and so that I'm not sitting out in the cold, basically. Okay? These people that have lost their homes would literally just throw these things together to have a roof over their head and maybe somewhere to build a fire. A lot of people would get together. Like I said, it's a Hooverville, so it's multiple people, a shanty town, okay, where people would get together so that they could have some semblance of, community that people can share with the fire. People can share what food and resources that they had, okay? And obviously, it's named Hooverville for a reason. It's named for Hoover basically as the blame started to be passed to him. So 1931 is really when things start turning sour. People start losing the hope in Hoover. They start losing hope in the federal government. More and more people are losing their homes. The unemployment rate at this point has jumped to 25%. That's extremely high. So they're not too happy with the situation, right? So Hoovervilles are named after Hoover because of who they want to blame for the situation, okay? I'm gonna show you guys a picture of a Hooverville just to give you a sense of where it was located, what they looked like, et cetera, et cetera. So this is what a Hooverville looked like for the most part, okay? This one is in California, so it is much bigger than some of the other ones that you might see, like closer to the Midwest, closer to like Iowa, et cetera, okay? But these Hoovervilles could be miles and miles long. As you can see, they're basically off the coast, or basically right off of some kind of industrial building, right? So they're taking basically all the scrap metal and trying to build a little home, a little shack, a little shanty, okay? Building these little shanties and living in Hoovervilles would basically avoid having to pay a mortgage, property taxes, et cetera, okay? You could use other people in this community as a resource if you didn't have your own. There was many other reasons that people lived in Hoovervilles, but most of the reason was because they'd already lost their homes. They were just trying to do the best they could, okay? These ones are nicer versions of these shanties, right? Like these people are kind of lucky that they're next to a dump or next to a place that has like metal scraps. Most of the time, these things would be made from cardboard or plywood or other like not so sturdy material, okay? Which means, especially if this is a Hooverville, maybe located near like the northeastern portion of the United States or in the Midwest, those winters are going to get really cold and things are going to get really bad. Okay. All right. So things are starting to turn sour in 1931. People have just completely lost hope in Hoover. Things are not looking good for a re-election per se, right? And by 1932, it really solidified the American persona of Hoover, okay? Things are going to change very drastically in 1932, not just in terms of Hoover's presence, but also in terms of the Great Depression. 1932 is the worst year of the Depression. Unemployment climbs to over 30%, the highest it has ever been basically in American history. Bank closures are starting to go up again. If you remember our chart a couple days ago, it gets really, really bad in 1933 when it comes to bank closures, but they're going to continue to go up in 1932. The economy is still tanking. The stock market is still awful. 1932 is the worst year of the Depression. Okay? By 1932, Hoover had nothing left. Okay? There was no more tricks up his sleeve. There was no more money that he could fork out. There was no more leadership. There was nothing else that they could do. Okay? So in response, Hoover did not take the high road. That's all I'll say. Okay? Hoover did not take the high road when addressing these problems to the American people, and he actually started turning on the American people. A lot of his speeches and a lot of the things that he you know, a lot of his addresses, et cetera, through 1932, basically took the tone of, you know, Hoover saying, I'm literally doing everything that I can to help you, and I have been for years, and you still hate me. This maybe seems like a you problem now. How about you make better decisions so this wouldn't have happened?
Did he literally say that?
Yes. That one's somewhat of a paraphrase, but there is at least 2 instances during addresses or during like appearances with American people where he said, well, if y'all wouldn't have been so dumb, basically, okay? There's multiple instances, like I said, I'm paraphrasing, but there's multiple instances where he basically says, how about you guys do better? Pull yourselves up by your bootstraps, get back to work. It's not that hard to get a job. How about you save better? Why did you buy so much stuff on credit? Why did you trust the stock market? You should have known that the stock market wasn't reliable, okay? Multiple instances of him saying stuff like that, okay? So if you are somebody who had lost all their money in the stock market, had just lost their homes because the economy crashed, is unemployed because your industry went under, maybe you're down to your last penny, you've been starving for days because you don't have anything to feed your family, and you turn on the radio and hear Herbert Hoover saying that, would you be happy? Absolutely not, right? The American people were not happy about the way that Herbert Hoover was addressing them, okay? Which again, I'll refer back to what I said earlier. If I was the president and I was in Herbert Hoover's shoes, I would probably be frustrated as well. But I would also probably know better to not take it out on the American people.
They are blaming a lot on him.
Oh, yeah.
Trying.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, I would be frustrated too if I was really trying to do everything, because like that's your job, right? Imagine you having a job and you just can't do well at it because of the circumstances that are given. I would be frustrated too. Or like, you know, you join a sport or something like that and you really want to be good at it, but it's just really difficult and you can't seem to get better. That's super frustrating, right? So with Herbert Hoover, I can absolutely see that. They start naming like homeless shelters after him, right? Like I would be mad too. But that's like the #1 rule of like public speaking. Don't talk to your constituents like it's their fault, right? Even if it is, don't talk to, you don't let them know.
Yeah, you do. How old?
Sometimes you gotta tell little white lies to save the relationship. No, I'm just kidding.
That's a lie. Relationships aren't things.
True. All right. So on top of all of this, okay, on top of the fact that 1932 is kind of a decline for Herbert Hoover, that he is not vibing well with the American people anymore. They are basically, he's already got one foot out the door, basically. They know that he's not going to get reelected. He doesn't really want to be reelected at this point. This is a really interesting situation. I wouldn't want to be president during this as well. But to make things worse, or, you know, the question of how do you make things worse from here? What else could possibly go wrong? The whole country is in a pit of shambles, basically. What else could go wrong, right? I'll tell you what else could go wrong. You piss off the veterans. That sounds like the next logical step, right? So Herbert Hoover said, how can I make this any worse? And he answered it by making veterans mad, which leads us into a conversation that we're going to continue tomorrow about the bonus army, okay? The bonus army, we're going to watch a quick video over them to give you a little bit of insider or kind of like a beginning information about the bonus army, and then we're going to do an activity about it tomorrow. But you guys can go ahead and put your notes away. That's all I'm going to need from you today. We're going to watch this video. It's just under 10 minutes, so it'll take up just a little bit of time, basically get us closer to that 3 o'clock hour. And then we'll have some time that if you need it to keep working on the causes of the Great Depression activity, okay? But I digress. Let's go ahead and watch a little bit about the bonus army.
In the 1930s, an army more than 10,000 strong marched on Washington, D.C. A congressman giving an impassioned speech on their behalf would die on the floor of Congress, and a famous World War general would become a villain when he unleashed tanks and tear gas on the men he had once stood beside on the fields and forests of France. The army would lose the battle, but eventually would win the war. The results of which would change the U.S. military forever. But it's one of the least talked about events in U.S. history. When 4 million American soldiers began making their way home from the trenches of France in 1919, they expected that the worst of it was behind them. But little did they know there would be even more challenges ahead. When they left the U.S. to fight overseas, soldiers left their homes, their families, and their jobs behind. During World War I, no protections existed to guarantee soldiers' jobs, and many struggled to find work after returning home. For some, they missed skills and promotions that fellow workers had achieved during their time in France. Others struggled to find work with permanent disabilities ranging from PTSD, then known as shell shock, to blindness to loss of limbs. Veterans found themselves unable to get the factory and labor jobs they'd held before the war. But finding a job wasn't the only problem. The missed wages while they had been overseas also put veterans at a disadvantage. While the soldiers had received a small wage, roughly the equivalent of $1 a day, their counterparts back home had been making $2 to $3 a day, and in some cases, up to $10. The resulting disparity in wealth left veterans frustrated and angry. Veterans began to lobby early on for Congress to right the wrong. They requested a pay differential, money that would make up the difference between the money they actually made and what the average worker back home was making. It quickly became contentious, as some saw it as veterans asking for above and beyond what they were due, with some detractors calling it a bonus. But in 1924, the pay differential request was approved by Congress. There was one significant condition, however. The bonus would not be paid out until 1945, more than 20 years in the future. The only exception was if the veteran died, and then the bonus would be paid out to the next of kin. Many mocked it as the tombstone bonus. On Tuesday, October 29, 1929, the stock market crashed and the economy crashed with it. The United States sunk into the Great Depression. Many people lost their life savings overnight. Others experienced a steep decline into poverty. Jobs, food, and homes were scarce. Veterans were often hit the hardest, and anger grew steadily throughout the early 1930s as veterans refused to wait another decade for money they should have earned in 1918. In 1932, Walter Waters, a World War I veteran from Burns, Oregon, learned of a bill that was laid before Congress that advocated for the immediate cash payment of the veterans' bonus. He became passionate about what it would mean for him and so many other veterans. Seeing the success of other lobbying groups in Washington sparked an idea. Veterans just needed their own lobby. Waters gathered a group together to board a rail car and head to Washington. The group called themselves the Bonus Expeditionary Force, or the BEF, in reference to their service in the AEF in World War I. As word of the movement grew, more veterans became interested. Many had no jobs or homes to tie them down, and saw the Bonus Expeditionary Force as the best means to achieve their goals. Through hitching rides and gathering donations in veteran marches, veterans and their families slowly made their way to the Capitol. Newspapers across the country began spreading word of the bonus army headed to Washington to take on the politicians. Meanwhile, those in Washington were getting nervous. President Hoover didn't want them to come. MacArthur and others saw them as a communist force and were concerned about civil insurrection and the possibility of a revolution. Helen Glassford, the DC police chief, however, was a World War I vet and felt sympathy for the cause, urging patience to those in leadership. Nevertheless, the Army began preparing with gas, tanks, and troops, many of the same hazards the bonus marchers had met with more than a decade before in France. By 1932, over 10,000 bonus marchers had arrived in Washington, and more were on their way. Setting up temporary housing and shacks and erecting tents in front of Congress, veterans banded together. In addition to concerns about communism and revolution, some in Washington also feared the color lines that were being crossed in the BEF camps. African American veterans and white veterans lived side by side, a symbol of hope for desegregation in a deeply divided pre-civil rights era America. Late that spring, Wright Patman of Texas sponsored a bill that would immediately pay the veterans in full. The bill inspired heated debates, with Congressman Edward Estlund dying of a heart attack on the floor of Congress during an impassioned speech promoting the bill. The House of Representatives would pass the bonus bill, 211 to 176, and by June 17, 1932, the bill was being debated in the Senate. Veterans held a vigil outside of Congress, chanting, "The Yanks are starving," and lobbying any member of Congress that would listen. The song, "Brother Can You Spare a Dime," became a rallying cry for veterans and for the country. But the bill would never pass the Senate, and Waters had to inform veterans they'd lost their battle with Washington. On July 16th, as Congress ended its session, senators and representatives were slinking out through secret exits to avoid having to see the veterans still camped on their front lawn demanding answers. The police department and the White House pleaded with veterans to leave, and eventually over 11,000 marchers did, but several thousand remained, refusing to give up. On July 28th, the police began to forcibly evict the veterans from their shanty homes. Chaos ensued as veterans threw objects and police reacted with force. 2 veterans were shot and killed by police, furthering tensions between the veterans and their government. Deciding that the police department was not handling the conflict well, Hoover authorized MacArthur and the military to evict the veterans back across the bridge to Anacostia. MacArthur, along with Patton and other World War I veterans, brought in the cavalry, infantry, and tanks. They began pushing veterans out of the city using smoke bombs and tear gas. When he reached the bridge, MacArthur decided not to follow Hoover's orders to stop. He instead ordered the troops to continue to pursue, and the veterans and the BEF panicked, believing the troops would kill them. The troops moved through the camps with fury, setting fire to shacks and roughly handling veterans and their families. Later that year, Hoover lost his bid for re-election, and on November 8, 1932, Roosevelt was elected president. The bonus army had been sent home, but veterans continued to show up in Washington every year to call for the release of their money. Though some found work through CCC camps, Roosevelt continued to struggle with the veterans on the subject of the bonus for years. Finally, in 1936, Congress passed the Adjusted Compensation Act. FDR would veto the bill, but Congress would override it. Nearly 18 years after World War I, 4 million veterans were paid in full. As United States involvement in World War II became inevitable, FDR and others began to think about the problems in payment and reintegration for veterans, seeking out a way to resolve many of the inherent problems World War I veterans had faced. In June 1944, the GI Bill was made law. It forged a new relationship between veterans, the military, and the government, and it allowed millions of veterans to go to college, reintegrate if they returned home, create small businesses, and buy homes.
All right, so I know it kind of went farther than what we needed to, but basically it was a good full circle that this conflict that we're going to talk about tomorrow or do a little bit of investigation about tomorrow is the reason that we have things like the GI Bill today that has specific standards for those who have served in terms of education and housing and payment, et cetera, et cetera. But basically what we're going to be looking at tomorrow, we've seen a little bit of information about it on what is happening and why the bonus army is upset. But for years after this bonus army riot or this bonus army expedition, whatever you want to call it, people were confused as to who started it, basically, or who to blame. We're in this period of blaming, right? We blamed Herbert Hoover for almost everything. Who do we blame for this as well? So tomorrow we're going to do a little bit of investigation to figure out whose fault this is, if it's anybody's, okay? So that being said, that's all we have for today. We've got a little bit of time left, and I really suggest that you go and finish up the Cause of the Great Depression thing if you had not finished it already, okay? Yeah.